Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 38 today. We're going to be looking at this same idea of a shifting landscape. We've looked at that now in Europe and also North America. Today we'll be centering on Latin America. And so we need to start by looking at kind of an update of where things stand in the Latin American countries during the 19th century. The political upheavals in Europe and North America were also felt in Latin America early in the 19th century. In the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, there had developed a tension between those recently arrived from Europe and the native descendants of early immigrants. So there was a group that had been there for quite some time, and they had basically gained a lot of wealth and had developed those colonies on the backs of the native population who they mistreated and used, and then also slaves they brought in, but yet they felt entitled to have more say than the new group that was coming in. But this new group had one thing going for them that the people that had immigrated or were descendants of immigrants from earlier days didn't have, and that is they had relationships with those who were in power in Europe because they had just come from there. So this created a tension that we're going to see throughout this time. Longtime residents who had built up wealth through the exploitation of Indian and slave labor felt they understood the affairs of the colonies better than the new arrivals and should therefore have a hand in running them. So it's kind of the deal where, hey, you're the new kid on the block, you need to listen to me. I've been here, I know the lay of the land. And obviously the new group coming in is not going to feel that way, and they're going to have support from back home. But appointments to all significant offices, both civil and ecclesiastic, were made in Europe, and therefore such positions were usually held by those more recent immigrants from Europe. This caused established residents much resentment. So this tension, again, we're going to see this all the way through. As a result, the wealthy established residents of those lands played a role in Latin America similar to that of the bourgeois in France. So this more established group, they would be the very upper class of the area, except that they weren't allowed to be in the ruling class. So that kind of gave them a little bit of a bump down and put them in somewhat of the same position as this merchant class that we see in France, the bourgeois. And as a result of that, they're going to be the ones that are going to push for some changes to take place because they're not getting the due that they think they just should have. In 1808, Napoleon deposed King Ferdinand VII of Spain and in his place crowned his brother Joseph Bonaparte. Spanish resistance to the usurper had its headquarters in Cadiz, where the Junta, or board, ruled in the name of the deposed king. So Napoleon comes in, he gets control of Spain, he then puts his brother in charge of the Spanish colonies, but there's resistance to that. And he's in charge of all of Spain and in the colonies as well. And what ends up happening is in all the areas around Spain, and eventually this pulls over into the colonies as well, there would be these boards that would rule. They're called juntas, and they were kind of the group that held the line. They were the group that stayed loyal to King Ferdinand in spite of the fact that they were being ruled by Joseph, and they are going to try to keep things going for this deposed king in hopes that things would change, which they would. Napoleon declared that all Spanish colonies should now obey King Joseph, but he did not have the power to enforce his authority. As a result, local juntas were organized in the New World. So we see the same group that is organizing resistance in Spain is now going to do that in the Spanish colonies in the New World as well. Therefore, the colonies began ruling themselves. Ferdinand VII was restored in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, but instead of showing gratitude to those who had preserved his territories for him, he set out to undo their work. So Ferdinand comes back into power. You would think he would look to those who resisted, who held the line for him, who tried to make sure that he would be able to come back and have something to rule. You would think he would look at them as gratefully, but he didn't. He wanted to strip the power that they had gotten and power that they used to keep the resistance up. He wasn't willing to allow them to have it. So he looks at them as a threat, actually, and it creates an interesting dynamic there in Spain and in the Spanish colonies. In Spain, he abolished the constitution the Cadiz Huentas had issued, but was forced to reinstate it in 1820. So he's going to get resistance back on him from the group that had originally supported him. And so we see a resistance movement begin to form in the colonies. Similar policies in the colonies brought resentment against Spanish policies, and soon those who had earlier supported the king rebelled. So the same kind of resistance we see in Spain from those who had tried to support the king and didn't get his backing. We're going to see that now in the colonies, and the same problem comes up. In the region often referred to as Rio de la Plata, modern-day Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, the Huentas simply continued to govern the country until independence was declared in 1816. So in that area, it was kind of a collective area that eventually became Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It wasn't at that time. It was just kind of a region. Those boards continued to govern, and they just stayed in power. They didn't really had anybody to stop them, and it remained that way until 1816. In 1819, Paraguay declared its independence from both Spain and the Rio de la Plata. Uruguay broke away in 1828, becoming an independent nation. So we see this area is going to start to break up. It's not going to stay as one collective body. It's going to break up into regions and then to different countries eventually. Meanwhile, Jose de San Martin invaded Chile, which had declared independence in 1818, so they had declared independence as well. At the same time, Simón Bolívar organized an army that defeated the Spanish and proclaimed independence of Greater Colombia, which in present day terms is now Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama, so that region. So Bolivar is going to come in, and he's got the idea he would like to basically bring everybody together in the whole continent. And he's going to find that that's not going to be easy to do. In fact, he's going to find that he can't do it, but he does do a lot to bring independence to the region. Next, Ecuador joined Greater Colombia, and Bolivar marched to the south, where Peru, which included what is now Peru and Bolivia, was also made independent. So he's breaking all these countries up. He's getting the ruling parties from overseas out and helping them to declare independence. Bolivar sought to create a vast republic embracing most of the continent, but this was not to be. Greater Colombia broke up into Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. In Peru, the region of Alto Peru insisted on independence and became the Republic of Bolivar, which is now Bolivia. So his dream of having this big nation that would encompass most of the continent, it didn't ever come to pass. And he finally said later on the area was ungovernable, in his opinion. It was a frustrating thing for him, as he fought hard to bring independence, but then he thought the ultimate goal would be to have one united nation, and that was just not going to happen. At the Panama Congress of 1826, Bolivar realized that regional interests, as well as those of the United States, precluded any close collaboration between the new nations, and he kind of had to give up his dream after that. Now let's look at Mexico and Central America. In Mexico, events followed a different course. On September 16, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo de Castilla proclaimed Mexican independence. So now we've got Mexico that's trying to gain independence at this point. Hidalgo was captured and executed, then succeeded by priest Jose Maria Morales. Central America, originally part of Mexico, proclaimed its independence in 1821. It later broke up into Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. So these nations that we know of that exist today, at one time they were part of Mexico, that Central American area, but they broke away, and now they're going to rule themselves and leave Mexico to kind of figure things out for itself. Brazilian independence also resulted from the Napoleonic Wars. In 1807, fleeing from Napoleon's armies, the Portuguese court took refuge in Brazil. So the Portuguese government kind of got out of there when Napoleon came around, and this is where they hid out, was Brazil. The emperor who had fled to Brazil returned to Portugal, but left his son Pedro as regent of Brazil. In 1825, Pedro I was crowned emperor of Brazil. In 1889, following the abdication of Pedro's son, Pedro II, the republic was proclaimed. So Brazil got an emperor that it didn't want, but then the second one, the son of that emperor, Pedro II, they got rid of him, and they proclaimed themselves to be an independent republic. Haiti gained independence as a direct result of the French Revolution. As soon as the French Revolution deprived the white population of military support, the blacks, who were the vast majority, rebelled. Independence was proclaimed in 1804, and it was acknowledged by France in 1825. So the fact of the French Revolution took away the military support to that country, and so the residents who were being held as slaves, or at the very least were being kept down, they were able to rise up and take over that country, and they did. And so Haiti gained its independence as a result of the movement of the military out of the country because of the French Revolution. Republican ideas from France and the United States provided the ideological framework for revolution and independence in Latin America, but this independence usually resulted in power held by the established upper class or in military leaders. So it really wasn't the independence that we think of, but it was independence from those foreign countries that held them as colonies. But when it all came down to it, it ended up not being really the independence that they would have liked, or that we would necessarily think of in the terms that we do in France, the United States, and Europe. So good that the independence came, but unfortunately they really ended up with power with the elite and even dictators, as we'll see in a moment. Toward the middle of the 19th century, there was great economic development on the basis of foreign capital and the exporting of agricultural products. In the cities, there also appeared an urban middle class made up of merchants and government employees. So things are changing as a result of commerce and the economic development of the nation. What was hoped was that the development of trade, industry, and education would eventually benefit all social classes, but economic progress required order, and thus dictatorships were often justified. Now, what it means by being justified is not that it was right that there should be dictatorships, but that was an excuse that was given and people went along with it. Basically, they said, okay, in order for us to gain prosperity, we're going to have a strong central government to make sure that happens. And so they were willing to even go to the extreme of supporting a dictator. And the dictator never really did help anybody, never really did help any of the lower classes, but they were scared not to go along with it. And so that's what ends up happening in a lot of these nations. By the turn of the century, many agreed that the continent was ungovernable. This view seemed to be warranted by the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910 and resulted in a long period of violence and civil disorder that impoverished the country and led many to immigrate. So let's put our focus now into what's going on in Mexico and leading up to that revolution time. Throughout the colonial period, the church in Latin America was under royal patronage. This included the naming of bishops by the governments of Spain and Portugal. This meant that the higher offices of the church were in the hands of more recent immigrants rather than the established classes in these colonies. So that's obviously going to lead to conflict. This brought the tension between social classes into the church. Although a few bishops supported the cause of Spanish American independence, most supported the crown. So there's going to be a big tension, and it's going to have to do with social and political issues coming back into the church and having an effect. After independence, most of them had to return to Spain, leaving many dioceses vacant. And this is going to be a big problem going forward, because now these positions are vacant. They can't be filled because of these political and social issues that are going to create a situation that makes it impossible for them to be filled. It was impossible to name replacements because Spain insisted on its ancient rights of royal patronage, while the new republics would not accept bishops who were named by the crown. These new governments also insisted on their right to nominate their own bishops, so you got a stalemate here. The Pope wavered at first, but eventually political pressure forced him to take a neutral stance. In Europe, France, Austria, and Russia joined Spain in opposing the acknowledgement of the new nations that would come with naming new bishops for them without consulting with Spain. So again, politics and religion mix in a way that's not good. The Pope can't name new positions in these countries, because if he goes around Spain and Portugal to do that, then he is in essence giving validity to these new nations, and that's not going to be popular with Portugal and Spain, but also with France, Austria, and Russia. So the Pope's in an impossible situation and ends up not being able to do anything. just taking a neutral stance, and that ends up with there not being leadership in these nations. Finally, in 1827, Pope Leo XII decided to name the first bishops for Colombia, but this did not end the matter because Ferdinand broke off relations with Rome and the Pope was forced to undo much of what he had done. So even though the Pope finally just said, we can't have a situation where there's no bishops, he appointed them, but had to go back and reverse course. It was only in the next decade that Pope Gregory XVI officially acknowledged the existence of the new republics and named bishops for them. So we're going to see this as being an ongoing problem during this time. That leadership vacuum is going to be filled with other things that's going to lead to big problems for the church. So we'll look at the church, the state of the church in these new nations, and we'll also look at what's going on in Mexico. The attitude of the lower clergy, mostly from the group who had descended from the early immigrants to the New World, contrasted with that of the bishops. In Mexico, 3 out of 4 priests supported the rebellion. 16 out of 29 signatories of the Declaration of Independence in Argentina were priests. So the priests are going to be in support of the rebellion. This ambivalent attitude of the church was a continuation of the two faces the church in Latin America had shown. While there were those, particularly in the higher echelons of leadership, who supported generally conservative policies, there were also many who supported political, economic, and social change. To complicate matters, it became evident that, regardless of what the church taught officially, the people actually understood and practiced their faith in a wide variety of ways. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The biggest one is they just didn't have the leadership in the countries that they needed in these nations, and that had to do with political reasons. The lack of priests led to less emphasis on the sacraments and more on religious observances and celebrations that did not require the presence of a priest, such as Saints' Day, the Rosary, promises to the saints, written prayers with supposedly magical powers, etc. So a lot more of the superstitious, ritualistic type stuff is going to take the place of what the priests would provide through the sacraments and through their own teaching and preaching. All of this was combined with the survival of many elements of the ancient religions of the native population and of the slaves brought from Africa. Later, an esoteric spiritualism brought from Europe, which emphasized reincarnation and communication with the dead, was added to the mix. So on top of the things that were more or less valid, maybe not completely, but a little bit more on the legitimate side, there was added even more elements that came from all kinds of religious backgrounds that were present in the nation and had nothing to do with Catholicism or Christianity at all. They were kind of just thrown in the mix. And then later on, some of these ideas from Europe get thrown in. So it's going to be a kind of a big melding of a lot of different religious traditions that come together to form what is going to be held by most of the people, especially the common people in Mexico and the other colonies, the other nations around. While most of this was understood in purely religious terms, much of it was also an act of resistance against the powerful who held sway over the church. By not going along with what the higher echelons of leadership said was the correct way, you're doing two things. You're kind of you're practicing your own religious beliefs, and they've kind of taken the place of what would have been there if there had been enough leadership involved and enough people on the ground. But you're also saying to those people, we're not going to go along with you. We don't agree with you on a lot of things, and we're not going to agree with you on this. So it was kind of an act of resistance as well. For these reasons, the attitude of the new political leadership towards Catholicism was complex. All called themselves Catholic, and the various early constitutions affirmed that Roman Catholicism was the national religion. But tensions with Rome were such that some, particularly in Mexico, proposed breaking with Rome and creating national churches. These sentiments appeared again and again whenever the popes seemed inclined to oppose the political interests of a nation. So the idea is that they're going to stand up against the Roman Church, and even to the extent of let's break up and create our own thing. It never came into fruition, but it was an idea that it didn't go away. Continuing on, after independence, the conflict between liberals and conservatives was also reflected in their divergent religious policies. Conservatives wished to continue the ancient privileges of the clergy and the church, but liberals opposed many of them. So we're going to have this conflict continuing to go on and on. It was then that many native clergymen who had earlier supported independence joined the conservative ranks. So the religious issues that had kind of spilled over into the church from the political are now going to shape how the political are going to go as well. So we're back to this, the influence of the church in the state and the influence of the state in the church are probably a little out of balance from what they should be. But it's not unusual. We've seen this all along. And it's not necessarily mandated, although in some ways it is, and definitely is in the appointing of officials, which is one of the big problems. But it's also a cultural thing, and it was going to be an issue regardless. So we're going to see this through this time as being a big point of emphasis as to what's going to happen here. The early liberals didn't oppose Catholicism as such, but the constant conflicts between liberals and the leadership of the church led to increased anti-Catholic feelings within the liberal ranks. So again, it's going to be more than just the religious things. It has to do with what's going on politically. It has to do with what's going on socially. It's more to do with liberal and political, or liberal and conservative social standing, even political standing, than it does really liberal or conservative experience with the religion. But that's not. But it's going to affect it. So we see this continue to be the issue as the time goes on here. In the second half of the century, liberalism espoused the positivist philosophy of Auguste Comte, and therefore became more anti-Catholic. So this guy Comte is going to come along, and he's going to have a big influence on what's going on here, and he is not down with the Catholic Church, really. Comte was a French philosopher and one of the founders of modern sociology, who was convinced that society could and should be reorganized following the dictates of reason. Now, we've talked about this before, but this is the age of reason. This is the age of scientific discovery. This is the age of people thinking that those ideas would then eliminate the need for spirituality and religion and negate them or disprove them. Doesn't end up being the case, but it definitely is going to affect things from that point on as society continues to hold to these ideas, or at least be influenced by them. According to him, humanity had gone through 3 stages of development: the theological, the metaphysical, and the scientific or positive. Comte believed that we are now in the scientific age, and therefore society must be radically reorganized on the basis of scientific or positive principles. So again, this is very common for this period of time, this idea that we've moved beyond religion. Now that was a crutch, or that was something that people needed in the past. We've moved beyond that now. We can put it in the past, and we can embrace science and observation and all of the things that come with that. And so this philosophy is going to very heavily influence the religious course in Latin America. The resulting society will make a clear distinction between spiritual authority and temporal power. The latter must be placed in the hands of the capitalists and merchants who best understand the needs of society. As to spiritual authority, this could be placed on a new Catholic Church without a supernatural God and devoted to the religion of humanity. Such ideas were widely accepted among the bourgeois in Latin America, especially in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. So it's not to get rid of the spiritual aspect altogether, at least not at this point, but Comte is saying that there's a spirituality to people that has to do with their humanity, but it doesn't have to do with a supernatural God. So let's eliminate that part of it, and we can create a new Catholic Church, and it's going to just deal with that aspect of people, what we call spiritual, what we call spirituality, whatever that quality is. It can still be dealt with in terms of what human beings need, but we can do it with taking the idea of God out of the picture. Obviously, the Catholic Church is not going to be real interested in this idea, but it does have a great influence, particularly on this bourgeois group in Latin America, and especially in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. The result was renewed conflict between liberals and the church, while states became increasingly secular. So the church is not going along with these ideas. There's going to be a conflict, and the states are going along with these ideas, and so they're getting further and further away from the church. let's look at now the Mexican Revolution and get to that. In Mexico, these 19th century trends culminated in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. After wars with Texas and the United States, the liberal government headed by Benito Juarez put an end to many of the traditional privileges of the church, eliminating the privileges of the clergy, who until then had been exempt from the jurisdiction of civil courts, ordering the church to divest itself of all property not related to its religious functions, and placing official records of birth, marriages, and deaths in secular hands. So a big move in this Mexican government, which was very liberal at the time, was to take away power that the church had, that religion had. And this is going to cause a dust-up to come about. All of this was included in the Liberal Constitution of 1857. When the conservatives appealed for help from Napoleon III, the French invaded the country and set up Maximilian of Austria as its ruler, and that happened in 1864. So the conservative group doesn't like what the liberals are doing. They ask for help, and the help they get is the French invade their country and set up a ruler in place of what had been the liberal government. This led to rebellion and the capture and execution of Maximilian in 1867, so he barely made it 3 years. After more civil unrest and constant conflicts between liberals and Democrats, Porfirio Diaz came to power. His rule was marked by 34 years of violent suppression of opposition and of a rapprochement between the church and the government, which relaxed the provisions of the Constitution of 1857. So more calls for rebellion, although things with the church weren't as bad as what they had been. By 1910, the repressive measures of the government and the constant impoverishment of the rural population led to revolution. Conflict continued off and on for years. So it's just going to be this constant issue between the common people and the government. By 1926, the supporters of the church led the Cristero Revolution, in which more than 30,000 rebels and almost twice as many federal troops died. When it became clear that neither party was able to suppress the other, a compromise was reached in 1929. So there's basically a stalemate. They're not going to be, neither side's going to be able to take control, and so they have to eventually just say, hey, we're not getting anywhere with this. Let's just come up with something and agree to disagree. All over Latin America, the second half of the 19th century also brought new waves of immigrants, mostly from Europe, but also from China and the Pacific coast. That wave of migration was of great importance for the religious life of the continent. So there's going to be a big influx of people. They're coming from Europe primarily, but there'll also be some that are going to come from further east in China and the Pacific coast, and they're going to make a big impact in two ways. Many of those wishing to immigrate were Protestants. Therefore, several countries felt obligated to grant religious freedom. And at first, it was religious freedom for the new immigrants, but eventually, for most of them, they expanded that to anybody. So all of a sudden, countries that were closed off to Protestantism sees a bunch of Protestants coming in that they need to help their economic development to continue, and their stance on things changes. Again, this is not unusual. We've seen this all on the way. And so Protestantism is going to gain a bigger foothold, not just with new people coming in, but even those that are already in the country. And we'll see where that leads in just a moment. The biggest consequence of immigration was the enormous growth in baptized Catholics, for whom the church could provide practically no ministry nor religious instruction. As a result, Latin American Catholicism became more superficial. So there's going to be tons of Catholics that come in with these immigrants, and they are baptized in part of the church, and they're used to doing things the way they're done back home, which is that they do have priests that help, that are there with them. They do take part in the sacraments. All of that stuff, they're not going to get that. And so now the whole religion in the country is affected by that. Eventually, many Latin American Catholics came to see faith as something to be held independently or even against the authority of the church. So more and more, their religious life begins to revolve around their own individual relationship with God and spirituality rather than their relationship with the church. Well, what does that sound like? That sounds a lot more like Protestantism. Therefore, when Protestantism made its appearance, it found the fields ripe for harvest. So this is going to lead into the Protestants being able to make a big move during this period of time and following into these Latin American countries. So we're going to cut it off right there. Thanks for taking time with me today. We're going to continue through this study as we look at some other areas and kind of this shifting landscape idea. And we'll do that again next week. So hope you can take time with me then. In the meantime, hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.